Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. So without further ado, let's get on and talk about dealing with anger in children and young people. So what I want to do today is to give you some kind of behind the scenes stuff on anger, where it's come from, and one of the things I'm conscious of is that anger shows up for quite a few different reasons. Now, we might not be able to deep dive into every single one of them, but I'm thinking from the perspective of some young people get angry because it's really successful at getting them attention that they are craving. Sometimes we have young people that get angry because they've done it so much, it just becomes a habit. Some young people get angry because they feel that they're maybe being violated in some way, and it's a way of them expressing the fact that they feel like a boundary has been crossed. Sometimes they get angry because no one else is in control, and it's a good way for them to be able to take control. So there's a lot of different motivations to what causes anger to show up. And we might not be able to get all of those covered here today, but we're certainly going to give you some good tips to go off and start working with, both on yourself in terms of how you interact with an angry child, but also for them directly to put into practice as well, so that they can start to effectively moderate and manage their own emotional states. So anger is a feeling of annoyance, and it often comes from a place of frustration and hostility. Those are all things that are connected to anger, but they're not necessarily the same as anger. They carry a similar thread to them. Sometimes people get angry because they feel that someone has behaved in an unfair, unacceptable, or cruel way towards them. Now, that's not to say that you as a parent are being unfair, unacceptable, or cruel, but it's about perception. And if your young person has a perception of that happening to them, then that may be where their anger is coming from. The word anger actually comes from a Greek word, which is ankon, which means a strangling. And if you think about it, anger is like it's got that intensity. It's like something you want to hold in, but it's trying to break its way out. So you can see why it's come from that particular word. And anger itself actually develops in a young person, well, in a child, well, in a baby, from around 5 months old. Only 5 months old. So if you think about it, when your baby was crying because you couldn't get the food to them quickly enough, and you knew, like, that sounds like an angry cry to me now, or it's an angry cry because you're not rocking them to sleep in the way that they might have wanted you to do. That's when it very first starts. And actually, it's where the patterns of behavior can begin as well. Because if they learn that that anger causes you to react in a favorable way, and means that they then end up getting the food that they wanted or getting rocked to sleep in the way that they had wanted, then they have started to train us. We are the ones that are starting to be programmed by their anger into making us do the things that they want us to do. Sometimes uncontrolled anger can lead to arguments, physical fights, physical abuse, assaults, and self-harm. And what we know about anger is that it isn't a raw it is a raw emotion. It isn't an emotion that is kind of coming as a result of like just rocking up on its own. It's there because of other triggers. There is something that is going on behind it or before the anger happens. All right, so anger comes along because other things have instigated it. We also know that anger is not classified as a mental health issue. Some of you may have had the experience of interacting with a service such as CAMHS, so the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, and you may have found that if your reason for contacting them was because you have an angry child, that there's a reluctance to provide the support for you unless there's other stuff going on as a result of that anger as well, such as self-harming. And the reason why is because anger isn't actually classified as a mental health issue. It's just an emotion. It's a pure emotion, but it is connected to quite a lot of other mental health issues. So the most common ones for psychiatric diagnosis related to aggression or anger or violent behaviours are oppositional defiance disorder. So you might recognise that one as ODD. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, so ADHD, has lots of connection to anger. Conduct disorder in children and adolescents. Actually, the name of that one changes if it continues into adulthood, and it becomes antisocial behaviour disorder, or potentially something more along the lines of psychotic behaviours, or even things like paranoid narcissistic personality disorders, borderline personality disorders, adjustment disorder with a disturbance of conduct, and intermittent explosive disorder. So if left untreated, anger can certainly cause further challenges down the line. It's not to say that it's going to be the catalyst to these other things happening, but it certainly doesn't help, and is most definitely one that we want to get on top of. So here's what I want you to imagine in your mind. I want you to imagine that the child or young person that you're dealing with has got this anger inside of them, and I want you to picture it like this. So it's going to be almost like a little fuzzy ball that's floating around inside their system, and then outside of it we're going to draw a boundary. So here we have our little fuzzy ball there of anger. Now they don't actually have a fuzzy ball of anger floating around in their body. It works more like a network in their neurology that lights up whenever that anger is triggered. And so what starts to happen is this fuzzy ball starts to sort of bounce into action, and it starts to push up against these different boundaries that are housing it. And this boundary is there to kind of keep it in its place, keep it safe and secure. What happens sometimes is that when that boundary continually gets pushed up against, it eventually starts to break down. And then what we see is that anger is kind of like free. It's like roaming free. Now it's going to show up wherever it wants to. It's no longer housed by those rules of the boundary. So previously they would only get really angry if X happened, but it was contained within that boundary. Now the boundary is gone. They can get angry at anything at any time. And maybe you're here today because you have a young person who is having an experience like that, of getting angry just at the drop of a hat. For the silliest, littlest things, their anger is firing up. And so that's happened because that boundary that used to be there has eroded. So what we want to do is to start putting some boundaries back in place. Now, before I get into the hows and whys and whens we go about doing that, I'm going to give you a few more fun facts around anger. So anger is not a primary emotion, as we mentioned. So it's not the emotion that shows up first. Now, that might be difficult to believe if you know someone who gets angry super quick. It might feel like they went from 0 to angry with nothing in between. And that's maybe just because they've got very, very good and well rehearsed at it. But actually, there's always going to be something that's going on before the anger. What we need to do is to figure out what that thing is. And that's the thing that we need to be addressing, not necessarily the anger itself, but the thing that causes the anger to occur. Anger is the emotion that is most likely to lead to violence. And often we'll see that stress and fear are big drivers for anger. So if you think about it, you know, we in ourselves probably become more short-tempered if we're a bit more stressed or under pressure. So that's where the strain there is coming from. With regards to fear, people become angry as a fear response, because when we are fearful, we feel disempowered, we feel weak, we feel out of place. One of the things that anger does for us is it elevates us. It gives us a sense of control. It gives us a platform. It gives us some authority. And anger demands attention. So if someone is feeling like they're not being heard, or they're not being acknowledged, or they're being disregarded in some way, anger is a really good antidote to that. It's more likely to affect boys and men than it is women and girls, but obviously that doesn't apply all of the time. And it sometimes becomes quite disproportionate to the circumstances in which the anger is showing up. We're going to talk more about that in just a little bit. Sometimes we see that anger shows up because of feelings of being rejected, feeling inadequate, as a response to failure, or because someone is fearful of being abandoned. So again, we're using anger as a way to sort of reposition ourselves, re-elevate ourselves, so we don't have to feel weak and frail and disregarded. Instead, we can feel strong and empowered and acknowledged. Anger can be a way to do that. And sometimes we might find that putting in behavior modifications to deal with anger actually ends up making it worse. The reason why is because, remember, we said anger is not the primary emotion. There's something going on behind it. If what's going on behind it is, for example, that someone is being hurt in some way, or they're being violated in some way, if we're not addressing that, and we just start putting in behavioral modification for the anger, we're not dealing with those other emotional needs that that young person is having. So, for example, we mentioned there that maybe they get angry because they feel inadequate in some way. Unless we address whatever's causing those feelings of inadequacy, just modifying the angry behavior isn't going to get rid of the issue. So here's what I want you to imagine for me. I want you to imagine that I've got a necklace, and it is like a pearl necklace like the Queen wears, or maybe your grandma. All right, now I want you to imagine I've taken off my pearl necklace, I'm holding it here, and there is the string in the middle, and then it's got lots of little pearls all the way along. And every single one of those pearls is going to represent a negative experience that I had in my life. And in therapeutic terms, in psychotherapy, we refer to that as a gestalt, where you've got all these different events that are all threaded together because they are similar in some way. So they all get threaded onto the same piece of string. And this particular one is a gestalt of negative emotions. So it's a load of emotions that are similar because they all carry the same negative emotion, and the negative emotion is going to be anger. So the very first incidence of anger that I'm going to tell you about was one of mine, was when I was age 7, and I was playing with my cousin in a sandpit that our granddad had made for us. And he lost one of his toy cars, and he accused me of stealing it or hiding it from him. And he went off and told our nan, and then our nan came out and she asked me where I'd put the toy car, and I didn't have the toy car, so I didn't know where it was. So we were all there kind of raking through the sand, but at the same time there was very much a finger being pointed at me, where have you put it? If you have it, you need to give it back now. And it caused like a really big argument because I wasn't giving back his toy car that I never had. So for me, I was feeling this real sense of injustice, and I was feeling quite victimized, and all of these things that were sort of putting me into that situation of feeling quite weak and violated and overpowered. It turns out the toy car was underneath a flower pot, by the way. So this bad experience where I wasn't really old enough to be able to kind of make my point and really, stand up for myself in the way that I might have liked to, causes that very first chain to get threaded onto my chain of pearls. So that is my first negative emotion to go onto my gestalt there. So the next one that shows up, age 11, my mum got really angry because I burnt the toast after we had been burgled that day. So she was super stressed out already. Then I burnt the toast and I set the fire alarm off, and she got really, really disproportionately angry with me, and we ended up having a massive blowout argument about it. Again, it was a situation where it felt quite unjustified. and I felt like I had not been treated fairly, and I felt like, you know, my feelings weren't being taken into consideration, all of these different things. We've got ourselves another pearl threaded onto the chain of pearls there. So the next one, age 14, someone told my mum that I had bunked off school when I had not. And I got into trouble, not for bunking off of school, but I got into trouble for not bunking off of school and for my mum believing that I did. And she just would not believe me. I even told her to ring the school up. I was like, call them. They did the register. I was there. I didn't skip school today. And I was never the kind of kid that skipped school anyway, let's be honest. But she was absolutely adamant. She trusts this, like, whoever it was that had said whatever they'd said over me. So again, there was this sense of like, this is unjustified. I'm not being treated fairly here. I'm not being advocated for. So it was another little pearl that went onto the chain of pearls. So all of these little injustices are kind of, you know, happening throughout our lives. We're all getting them threaded onto this chain of pearls until one day something else happens when we're much older. So age 35, my mum had made a promise to help me out when I was going to be moving house. And so I had given notice to my landlord for where I lived, and I'd given notice to the landlord for where I rented an office and where I worked. And right after doing that, she said, actually, I can't help you out anymore. And suddenly I had nowhere to go and no money to go anywhere else. And she, at the time, I don't think the situation was handled by either of us in the best possible way. It resulted in a very big argument because I felt very let down, and kind of out there on my own, and like, you know, a promise hadn't been fulfilled and all of those sorts of things. My reaction to that, though, wasn't proportionate to the event. My reaction was based on that first poll from age 7, the next one at age 11, and the one after that at age 14, because now I don't react just to this one incident, I'm reacting to all of them that are threaded on this chain of pearls. And what you also might have noticed when you're dealing with a young person is not only is their reaction disproportionate, because they're not reacting to today's event, they're reacting to all of the historic ones, but that the way that in which they behave is like when they were younger. They're behaving like a 3-year-old. You know, you have a 19-year-old here and they're behaving like they're 7. What's going on? Well, that's because their emotional reaction that they're having with you right now is based on that very first event that happened when they were 7 years old. That's where it's coming from. They're not consciously doing that. They don't know that this is happening for them, but that's where it's coming from at that time. So we end up then with this gestalt of negative emotions really causing some challenges for us later on, because we react disproportionately because we're actually working on the back catalogue of injustices that we've experienced, and we're also working perhaps emotionally off of one of those earlier experiences where we might have been very much younger. What we do with techniques like CBT and NLP and hypnotherapy is we only have to work on one of those events. Typically, it's either the most recent or the most significant. And when we use an intervention based on one of those events, it does the job for all of the events. So we don't need to work on every single one of them, thank God. And what that means is, if you imagine my chain of pearls is here, by working on one of them, I cut the chain. Now all of the pearls fall off. None of them can stay on there because we've cut it in half. All right, so that's essentially what we end up doing with our interventions, but it also explains why sometimes what we see with our young people is reactions that are disproportionate and also quite immature in how they respond. So let's talk about some solutions. The solutions that I'm going to give you are going to be partially suitable for in the moment when they're actually angry, and some of them will not be ones for you to use in the moment. Some of them, it's just not going to work whilst they're actually having a meltdown. We need to wait until later when they're able to reflect, and also to do so with a better repertoire of emotions available to them. So the first one that I'm going to tell you about is an in the moment reaction that you can have, and it's called pacing and leading. This is something that comes from rapport building, which is a key principle to the work that we do, is making sure that we've got great levels of rapport and trust with the young people that we're working with. And pacing and leading is a way of doing that. So there are three things that make up the way in which we communicate with others. What we say, how we say it, so our tone of voice, and also how we use our bodies. When we are pacing and leading, we're paying attention to those three areas and making sure that we use our communication in the same way as the other person, because we like people who are like us. So if we can see that they talk a bit like us, or maybe have a posture similar to us, on an unconscious level, we acknowledge that, and it makes us feel a better connection to that person. So that's the pacing part, is doing what they do. The leading part is where we then take them to somewhere else. Now, let me give you a working example of this. Let's say that you have a young person who is using quite a strong tone of voice and maybe, quite a forceful looking physiology. And so they say to you, I don't want to do that, and I don't know why you're trying to make me. You've got a couple of options about how you respond to that. You could respond to that by going, it's okay, it doesn't matter. But that's going to be a really big mismatch from what they just came at you with. And it could make you seem a little bit back-footed and put you in a weaker position. If you were to respond to them by kind of putting yourself in a similar physiology and using a similar tone, but without going into an argument, so without using your words to create argument back to them, or to try and supersede their point with a better one or something like that. If you respond with, listen, we're going to have to do something here, and I don't know if you've got a better idea than me, but I'm willing to listen to it. So how about we take it down a notch and see if we can figure this out together, because I think that's going to be a better way of us dealing with this situation. So what you do is you start where they are. That's your pacing. Similar tone, similar physiology. But then you begin leading, which means that you move to a different place, like you bring your physiology down, you bring your energy down in your tone of voice, so that then you start to lead them to where you want them to be. All right, so that's what pacing and leading is all about. Start where they are, and then you bring it to where you want it to go. Now, this is not always an easy thing to do, don't get me wrong, because sometimes children are quite provocative. They can be quite cruel sometimes. And so you have to remember you're the grown-up here, and it is your job to sometimes act in a way that isn't a true reflection of how you're really feeling. So you might sometimes need to act angry when you're not. You might sometimes need to act calm when really you're not. But that's what you need to do. You've got to get good at acting to be able to deliver this really well. So on that note around the physiology, I'll also mention that you want to put yourself into a physiology that allows you to carry a degree of certainty about you. There's a really good YouTube video, a TED Talk by Amy Cuddy, all about superhero postures and how you can change your emotional state by being in the right physiology. So she talks about like the hands on the hips, head up, shoulders back kind of superhero pose. And this is a really good one for getting you to feel a bit more empowered. Feeling empowered when you're dealing with an angry child is really important, because as we mentioned earlier, sometimes what we see with children is that they are looking to create certainty, and they do that by using anger to make them feel more powerful. If you are in a weaker position than them, if even if, let me give you an example. Let's say that you say, no, you're not going to go out with your friends tomorrow. That's not okay. I don't want you going out, all right? So you're saying all the right stuff, but the way in which you're saying it and your physiology and your reaction tells them, oh, I'm really not sure about myself right now. That's when things can get out of balance, because they want certainty. They want someone to be in control, and if it's not going to be you, it will be them. And I've met families where the child is the one who is the head at the table, top of the hierarchy, they are the boss. And those are never the families that do very well, in my opinion. We need an adult to be doing the adult bit. So you need to make sure that when you engage with an angry child, that you maintain a sense of certainty about you, and that that comes through in how you are physically showing up in front of them. That doesn't mean that you need to become a finger waggling blamer or anything like that. It just means that you've got to have presence and you've got to hold your own. Another thing that can be quite useful to do in the moment stuff is something that we call a pattern interrupt, which kind of does what it says, in that you are going to be interrupting what's going on in that moment. So that pattern of anger is going to get interrupted. One of the best pattern interrupts that you can use for an antidote to anger is laughter. If you can make someone laugh, like we've all had a situation like this, where someone has made you giggle when you were angry, and then you're kind of angry because they took away your anger because now you're laughing. It's like you cannot hold on to anger when you are laughing. It just doesn't work. So this is a really useful way to be able to just disperse it super quickly. Now, like all comedy, your timing is important. You don't want to land yourself in a situation where you wind them up even more because they think you're taking the mickey out of them. But sometimes it's just about using the right intonation at the right point in time. If you notice that before someone's gone full-blown anger, that their voice is starting to elevate, it's maybe getting a bit sharper and it's getting a bit higher and a bit louder, and then you come back with, whoa, 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 didn't need to go that way. Come on now, here's what we need to do. And you just jolt it in that way. Sometimes that's enough to be able to interrupt it and break the pattern. And the good news is, the more times you do pattern interrupts, the more you start to break the system. So we'll talk in a while about how anger happens because of the sort of build up of events, this sequence of internal and external things that happen. And when we use pattern interrupts, what we see happening there is that the strategy to get to anger keeps getting interrupted. If you imagine like an old record playing on a record player, and you keep going in and scratching it every time it plays, eventually you can't play that CD. It will not play in the same way at all anymore. And that's what a pattern interrupt is all about. Another one that's quite useful to do as an in the moment strategy is to create some physical distance. Sometimes we have a habit of wanting to jump in and solve the problem too soon, and actually we just need to let the anger pass before we can, you know, really do our good work. So create some physical distance, and that might be important from a safety perspective too. The next one is really around after, post anger, like when the calm down starts to happen, and that is to address whatever it is that caused the anger to happen. Don't attempt to do that when they're in the bad state. When they're angry, we don't want to be addressing any fears or discussing where this is coming from. There's no point in doing it at that particular point in time, because when people become angered, their vision and everything internally shuts down. They're on a very narrow view of the world and of themselves and everything. And actually all of their other intelligence, resources and everything else is all still there. They've just closed off from it. They can't access it. So there's no point in asking them intelligent questions about, where do you think this anger is coming from? Because they can't tell you yet. We need to wait until later when they've gained perspective on it and they've got back the access to all of the other resources and intelligence and things that they can normally use for their thinking power is back in their hands again. So what we can do to address anger, one of the things we might want to explore is, was there something that maybe was a fear that triggered this anger? did this anger come from a place of fear? As I mentioned earlier, very often in my experience, I find that anger is coming from a place of wanting to reposition themselves from feeling not powerful to powerful. And so it's really about, I feel weak, scared, worthless, but if I'm angry, I feel strong, in control, and powerful. What we want to be doing is going, sorry, go back to that weak, scared, worthless. Tell me, where's that coming from? What's that all about? So here's some useful questions that you might want to make a note of that are really good for when we get to that discussion portion with our young person. So first of all, we've got what was behind that anger. All right, so if anger is here, what was behind it? And then another one which sounds similar, but you'd be surprised. Language is sort of wired up within each of us quite individually, and internally it can be quite a different experience. Some people might not be able to tell you, like, what was behind the anger? Like, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. Then if you say to them, what was underneath the anger? They can tell you what was underneath it, but they couldn't tell you what was behind it. So it's just because we represent stuff to ourselves in different ways. Recently, I was doing some research about different ways in which people represented stress to themselves. And some people were saying that they feel overwhelmed, which means the stress is kind of on them and on top of them. Whereas other people were saying that they might feel pressured, or they've got their back up against the wall. And all of these metaphors are sort of telling us something about the way in which they represent the experience to themselves. So some people wouldn't know that anger had something behind it, but they might feel that there was something underneath it. A good question to ask is, what were you feeling right before you got angry? Okay, so what that's doing for us is, if we were to say that the final step in what's happening for this person is that they get anger, they feel angry, and then before they get angry, something else we know is going to be occurring, because we know that anger doesn't just show up in isolation. It's not a primary emotion, something's coming before it. And there might even be something that happens before that. So what we end up with is this sequence where we've got anger as the outcome, but there's something happening before it and something happening before that. So that's what we refer to as a strategy. A strategy is when we have a sequence of internal, so stuff that's going on for us inside, how we're feeling, how we're talking to ourselves, and external, so stuff that's going on in the world around us that we see, hear, feel through our senses, that leads us to a specific and ideally a desired outcome. But sometimes it's not a desirable outcome at all. So anger is a culmination of a sequence of events, of internal and external experiences that leads us to a particular place. If we can start thinking about, well, what was it that happened? What was the feeling that you felt before you got angry? That will give us a clue as to what it is that we really need to be working on. We want to be working on that feeling that happened before they got the anger, not the anger. What were you thinking right before you got angry? You know, sometimes anger is quite a heady experience for people. Sometimes it's related to what they are thinking about, the pictures that they're making in their minds, seeing the worst case scenario rolling out before them. So they're doing some bad thinking in their head, maybe a bad thought that activated the anger. So what were you thinking right before you got angry is another good question to ask. And then finally, saying to yourself right before you got angry. So we all talk to ourselves inside our heads. And if you just thought to yourself, what does she mean we all talk to ourselves inside our heads? That's the talking to yourself that I'm talking about. So that internal self-talk that we have can sometimes, like, we can wind ourselves up pretty well. We really can. And so if they are talking to themselves in a way which maybe has a tone of voice which is a bit off, maybe is saying some unhelpful words to them, then telling themselves those bad things might cause them to anger themselves. So they kind of activate their own anger by telling themselves bad things. When it comes to communicating with others, the process works slightly differently. So communicating internally is different to communicating externally. When we communicate with others in the outside world, communication is broken up into 3 areas. We have the words, our tone of voice, and our physical body. And if we break those down onto a dodgy looking pie chart, you can see that we've got words up here is only 7% of how we communicate with others. Our tone of voice is 38%, and our physical body is a whopping 55% of our communication. Now that means a few things in relation to what we've talked about already. Thing one is that if you are interacting with an angry person, you need to make sure that your physiology is coming from a place of certainty, because it's 55% of your communication. You need to make sure that your tone of voice is ideally pacing and leading with them, taking them from maybe a very high state and bringing it down gradually into a much lower, slower, calmer place, step by step. So we do that using our tone of voice, because that one carries 38% of what we say. Actually, only 7% of our communication comes from words. It's partly why when we've had an argument with someone, we remember more about how they said stuff and what they looked like, rather than what they actually said. Very often we think we remember what they said, but we remember it wrong, because words are only 7% of their communication anyway. We're much more likely to remember what we thought they said based on the tone with which they said it, rather than the words they actually said. So for example, if they said, well, I think you look really nice today, later we could recall that as, you said I looked awful. And they go, no, I didn't. My actual words were, I think you look really nice today. No, you didn't. You said I looked awful. That's because the intonation carried the message of, I think you look awful, whereas the words were saying something quite contradictory. So that's part of the reason why we want to be really clean with our communication when we are interacting with someone who is in an angry state. But the other thing is, you know, that physiology carries so much meaning. We want to make sure that our physical bodies are coming from a place of certainty, and that that is leaking out through how we interact with them and what we say and do. So some other things that we can give them to do, rather than thinking about how we react toward them as practitioners and parents, is teaching them mindfulness. So mindfulness can be as simple as, for example, taking a moment to take a few deep breaths, but doing it whilst fully tuning into your senses. So for example, I could say to you, like right now, just look around the room, see what you can see around you. But that's not really mindfulness. You know, when you are being mindful, you are really being present in your body and not just kind of up there in your head being distracted by your thoughts. So for me, it would mean looking around and noticing the textures, the way the light bounces off of different surfaces, different shades of color, the way in which there is different shape to the objects around me, how there is sometimes little tiny speckles of dust actually that are showing up everywhere. So it's about really laser focusing. If I were using my hearing to help me be more mindful right now, I might be focusing on the sound of the clock ticking in the background, hum of the traffic outside. It's like a small buzz to the computer. I can be aware of the sound of my own breath. So that really gets me into a mindful state through hearing. And then we can do the same thing through our feelings. So it could be, notice the temperature on your skin right now. Notice how your body feels on the surface that you're sitting on, or the way the fabric feels against your skin from your clothes. So all of these things get us tuning into being in our body. Now, one episode of this is probably not going to cut the mustard when it comes to helping to reduce someone's anger. It's about using that as a kind of daily program of mindfulness to help them opt out of all the stressy stuff that might otherwise be going on in their heads. Now, speaking of that kinesthetic side and sort of tuning into what you're feeling, we've also got stuff around internal feelings, not just the tactile stuff going on around you. One of the things that we use in NLP is a process called submodalities. So a modality, quite simply, means one of your senses. So vision is a modality, hearing is a modality, smelling, tasting, did I get all five? Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling. Those are all modalities. A submodality is just an extra bit of detail, some extra info about one of your five senses. So for example, with vision, a submodality could be whether you see something in color or whether you see it in black and white. It could be whether you see it as being near or far away, whether it has a frame around it or whether it's panoramic. So those are all your submodalities. When it comes to hearing, submodalities could be whether the noise is high-pitched or low-pitched, whether it is loud or quiet. And when it comes to kinesthetic, so our feelings, those are both emotions, but also internal feelings and tactile feelings as well. Excuse me. With those ones, we can do some really good work on anger, because very often there are quite strong physiological expressions with anger. Someone might report that they've got a feeling somewhere between like their head and the bottom of their torso. They're going to be having some sort of internal feeling. They might also have things like their heart rate speeds up. Maybe they get shaky, sweaty, bit clammy. All sorts of different physiological shifts happen when we get angry. So if we have a young person who is able to identify, yeah, like I have a feeling and it kind of starts off somewhere between my tummy and my chest, and then we say to them, well, if that feeling had a color, what color would it be? And they say it's bright red or it's orange. And then we go, well, what would happen if it were green? What would happen if it were yellow? We can start to make some changes and adjustments to the form of that feeling that they associate with anger. If we were to say to them, like, does it feel like it's moving or steady? And they say, yeah, it kind of feels like it's spinning round really fast like this. And we go, what happens if you spin it in the other direction? Does it still feel angry or does it take you somewhere else? So we can start to like really drill down into these internal experiences that come with something like anger. By making changes and adjustments to it, we're able to change the way the experience feels. So this can work on in the moment stuff, but it can also work on old memories as well, because we use submodalities to code our experiences. When we make changes to submodalities, we're changing the code, which means that we change the way we experience that experience going forward. So it's a really quick and powerful way for us to be able to help young people shift that emotion of anger. Another one that I would like to mention is around, for us as the parent or practitioner, making sure that we separate out the angry behavior from the person. It's really easy to sort of fall into the trap of going, oh, I've just got such an angry 14-year-old at home. And then they kind of become the angry 14-year-old, because people have a habit of living up to their labels, even if the labels aren't particularly good for them. And when we start to kind of see that as part of their identity, we begin to react to them through that lens. You know, it's like putting on a pair of yellow sunglasses, like suddenly every time we see them, they look yellow. So what we need to do is get really good at going, this is my 14-year-old, sometimes they have anger, and to separate that behavior from the person themselves. It's actually one of the presuppositions in NLP. We have these kind of codes or beliefs, if you like, that we subscribe to help us be good practitioners, and people are not their behavior is one of them. I remember when I was working in private day nurseries, it was always so easy to kind of label up a child as the biter. and then you were like constantly sort of flinching when they came near you because you had that idea that they might bite you even if they weren't intending to. So it was really important to say, this is a child, sometimes they bite, so that you still see them as they are, as a person in their personality, and not through the lens of this unwanted behavior that they have. We want to be careful as well that when they have made some progress, or even if the progress is that they have learned to apologize or feel remorseful after an angry outburst, we want to take time to acknowledge that, so that we begin to shape their behavior more towards the appreciation we have of them not doing it and giving attention there, rather than our reaction and the attention that we end up giving them because they have been angry or they are being angry. So make sure that you acknowledge the efforts that they make to begin to correct this behavior. And then one final thing I will leave you with is around their self-talk. All right, so giving them some direction around how they begin to communicate with themselves internally in a different way, to begin interrupting that, correcting that, being kinder to themselves on the inside, is one of the best things that they can do for themselves. Even if they're not using their self-talk to trigger the anger, you can bet your bottom dollar that they're going to be using their self-talk to beat themselves up on the other side of it and to tell themselves bad things about themselves. This is something that we can all slip into, even me, and I teach this stuff. I remember coming home from work a few days back and being super tired and having a stack of washing up to do that I'd forgotten about. And I was really hoping to have a nice relaxing evening, and it clearly wasn't going to start out that way. So I did all my washing up and then turned around, having emptied out the bowl of dirty water, and saw that there was a breakfast bowl that I'd missed. And in my head said to myself, for God's sake, now we've got to do a whole other bowl of washing up just because you forgot this one. And then kind of stopping myself and going, it's just breakfast bowl though, isn't it? And having a bit of a chuckle to myself about how dramatic I was being inside my head. And it would have been really easy to have just rolled with that and, you know, completely reprimanded myself and beaten myself up because I'd forgotten to wash up one breakfast bowl. It's easy for us to slip into these things, particularly if we're a bit stressed or a bit tired, and it's completely unnecessary. So talk to them about being kinder to themselves on the inside. Now, a lot of the tips I've shared with you today actually came from a webinar that I hosted probably a year or so ago now, which was called Managing Anger. So if you are watching this on YouTube, check out the description box below, and I'm going to include a link there to that full webinar, because there was loads more stuff that I covered in it that might be helpful for you. Hopefully you've got some good tips both for yourself and also for you to share with the child or young person that you're dealing with as well. And there may be quite a few other bits of materials that we have around anger, so I'll include all of those in the description box, because we had like 12 of you sign up within an hour for this one, so I know that this is a really popular topic at the moment. So we'll do our best to make sure that you've got some other resources from other organizations and places that you can check out as well. And make sure that you also check out all of the other webinars that are on this YouTube channel too, because there's been a whole host of different ones. There was even a quiz on anger that you might find quite useful and interesting, so go check that one out too. But for now, thank you all so much for watching and listening. It's been lovely to talk to you, and I'll see you all on the next one. Bye.